He is also a slop badger and small bean regarder. He's here tonight to answer for his actions. Ronan Caughlin.
It doesn't seem a year since last year. But then again, when I look into the audience and see the faces of those who were here last year and see how much older they're looking this year, I realize a year has indeed passed. But you may be gazing at me and thinking much the same. I have to admit, there are silver threads amongst the silver. Now, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Shall I start? No, I'd better not start again. I was just being foolish. You all look amazingly young. Mind you, I can't see any of your faces. That helps. Now, there are fairies in the bottom of my garden. Well, I hired it out to the Gay Rights Liberation Front for a while, and that is possibly something to do with it. But no, in the old days, everybody believed in fairies. Even people who lived in towns far away from the country, they always believed there was something else out there. And of course, there is something else out there. There are several tenths. But could fairies possibly exist? Now, just before I start on this heavy topic, I must apologize for the state of my trousers. The reason is I bought these trousers myself, without the supervision of my wife. A very, very foolish thing to undertake, because I am rotten at buying clothes. And I bought trousers that are 2 sizes too large for me. Take a belt! I'm doing a bit of drama here. Take a belt. Take a belt. Don't get nervous. I'm not really. Take a belt, that's it, she said. And I forgot. So it's all right, so long as I inhale in a certain way, my trousers won't drop off. But should I start to hyperventilate due to tension, you are all urged to hold your programs above your eyes. I just say that by warning because I understand it's a legal requirement. Now, if you say you believe in extraterrestrials, well, people will say, fine, you're a nutter, most people will say, but they'll say, fine. If you say you believe in the Loch Ness Monster, they'll say, fine, you're not very orthodox in your outlook, but fine. You're a bit peculiar if you believe in such things. But if you say you believe in fairies, people will say, you're utterly round the twist. And the reason is, nobody is supposed to believe in fairies, except small children. And nobody realizes how wise small children can be. Some of them, anyway. But the thing is that just because everyone says something cannot be true, doesn't mean it isn't. Something gives rise to these beliefs. The thing may be there, it may not be there. But there is definitely something that started the ball rolling. Now, let's imagine primitive man. We mostly think of primitive man walking along like this. But primitive man didn't walk along like this. He walked along in a sprightly way, just like everybody else. But he didn't know a great deal about nature. And he knew about the sort of nature that meant that that plant was good to eat, that plant was not good to eat, and that plant would give you the squits for 3 days. But he had the feeling that there must be little things that supervised nature. And he may not have been wrong. Now, if you go along and say, I'm going to try to prove the existence of fairies, you won't get very far, because scientists these days won't accept anything as proven unless you put it on a laboratory table and chop it into little bits. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were a goblin, gnome, or even an ogre, I would not want to be put on a table and chopped into little bits. I would protest vociferously. So, oh, don't tell me you're going to start again. I remember you from last year. But the truth of the matter is that you can't prove the existence of fairies to the satisfaction of a scientist using present-day criteria. Now, they may develop things in the future that will allow you to prove the existence of fairies, but not yet. The only way you can see if there might be fairies is by what is termed anecdotal evidence, stories people tell in which they claim to have seen fairies. But there's another problem here. If you say you've seen fairies, people are inclined to inquire into your drinking habits. They are inclined to suggest that your mental health is not all it might be. In fact, they're inclined to think you're a lunatic. So if you should happen to see a fairy, let us suppose I'm looking around and I see a little pixie trotting down the steps. Well, I'm not going to say it because I'll be investigated seriously by psychiatrists. I am going to keep quiet about it. Now, sometimes this leads to confusion. Take the tooth fairy, for example. Belief in the tooth fairy who leaves something under your pillow if you have a tooth that comes out is actually quite old. A lot of people think it's a modern American thing. It's not, it's quite old. But the tooth fairy can give rise to misconceptions. I remember when my little boy came home from school one day in a great state of excitement. I know who the tooth fairy is. It's Daniel Thompson's father. Now, Daniel Thompson's father was a tough railway porter, and if you tend to think of fairies as svelte elemental beings that move in a graceful way, well, then it's not Daniel Thompson's father, believe me. I mean, he communicates in the odd grunt and that. He could perhaps pass for a goblin, but fairy, no. Fairy, no. But actually, there are some fairies that we can say we know where they came from. Some fairies are undoubtedly the gods of the people who used to be pagans in various countries. These are what are called the trooping fairies. And they're called that because they are believed to go around in troops. But if you study the mythology of those countries, you'll find the gods of them have the same name as the fairies. In Ireland, they're called the Tuatha De Danann, and they are supposed to be remarkably beautiful, both male and female, and they go riding around on the most glorious horses. Never try to sell any of them, but they aren't the kind of fairies I'm going to talk about today, because they're not seen that often. People don't report them. What people tend to report are little goblin-y fairies. Some of them aren't terribly nice looking.
I'm a big one.
Oh, I'm a big one, yes. Most people these days who report fairies report little people. Now, Professor Caughlin, who studied a great deal of fairy lore, was always under the impression that the elves were not little people originally. But as people kept cutting down forests and not finding elves there, they shrank in mythology, and he may well be right. But there are various other small creatures that have been seen, mannequins, if you like. Some of them no bigger than that. And what I'm going to do today, first of all, is read you accounts by one or two people who actually claim to have seen fairies. Now, the accounts may not be true. I can't vouch for them. I have taken them from various books of folklore. But the whole problem here is that you're not going to get accounts backed up by cinefilm and 15 witnesses, including 2 traveling Mormon missionaries. You are just going to get generally 1 or 2 people who claim to have seen them. But what does convince me sometimes that there are little people out there is the cumulative number. That means all the numbers taken together. Lots and lots of people claim to have seen little people. Now, in the last no, it's not the last century. Yes, it was. The early part of the last century. Ever since 2000 passed, I've been hopelessly confused over time. In the last century, there was an American explorer, and like most American explorers, he was a trifle gauche. He would sort of come in, I'm an American explorer from a modern country, and I'm going to look at this. His name was Evans Wentz, which indicated he was a very mixed ancestry. But he wrote a book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And he got some of the most well-qualified folklorists to help him do this. Actually, in Ireland, he got Douglas Hyde, who not alone was a great folklorist, he was also the first president of Ireland, and he wrote books in the Irish language. Now, Douglas Hyde wrote a preface to this, and he says he doesn't actually believe fairies exist at all, but he likes to collect the folklore. But Evans Wentz talked to a whole lot of people who claimed to have seen fairies, and I'll give you 1 or 2 examples. You see, a lot of people don't think I prepare anything in advance. There is a vile canard going about that I never write anything in advance. I just make up a lot of nonsense as I go along. As you can... As you can see, there is not a shred of evidence in that. I have come carefully prepared. Now, Evans Wentz writes about one sighting. William McGarry of Ballinderry, as his daughter, who is married to James McGarry, JP, told me. Oh, well, if his daughter is married to a JP, of course, she must be speaking the truth. Was one night going to Crumlin on horseback for a doctor, when after passing through Glenavy, he met just opposite the vicarage 2 regiments of them. Now, why do I say of them? Katie, I nearly scared the liver out of you there. I do beg your pardon. I say them because people were very, very reluctant to use the term the fairies. If you used the fairies, you drew them on you. In the Irish language, they were generally known as Nadina Shia, the people of the mounds. There were a lot of mounds in Ireland, and they contained dead corpses, which had been there for thousands of years, which probably accounts for why they were dead. But they were also known as Nadina Maha, the good people. If anyone here has read not the Midnight Folk, the other one, what is the second book Macefield wrote? The Box of Delights, yes. You will remember in it there is a mouse. And the mouse speaks of the fairies of the days of yore. But he never calls them the fairies. He says they were very, very good people. he thinks there might be the odd one still about, and there is, as the book further discovers. But if you were in a hurry, you just said, you either called them the gentry, the noble folk, or simply them. Well, he met 2 regiments of them coming along the road towards Glenavy, one regiment dressed in green and one in red. They were playing music. It wasn't an outside concert of some traveling musicians, but when they opened to let him pass through the middle of them, the music ceased until he had passed by. Now, if this story existed on its own, you would seriously question whether the man could do with some form of psychiatric medication. These diazepam I take, I find very useful in that respect, by the way. But there are dozens of similar stories. They're not found just in Ireland. They're found all over the world. If anyone has ever come upon a book called American Elves by Roth, it contains the Native American little people, and some fairly big people too. Some of them are a bit bizarre, kind of half wasp and half man and that sort of thing, a rather unpleasant combination. But such reports tend to come in from everywhere. Now, another report actually describes the gentry. These seem to be the Tuatha Dé Danann, the old gods. The man who saw them said, "The gentry are the finest folk I have ever seen." I learned this Irish accent from Jonathan, by the way. It's not my own at all. "The gentry are the finest folk I've ever seen. They are far superior to us, and that is why they are called the gentry. They are not a working class." There's Karl Marx on the other side of somewhere. He's going to take it up with the fairies in due course. "They are military aristocratic, tall and noble appearing. They are a distinct race between our own and that of spirits, or so they have told me. Their qualifications, they're tremendous. We could cut off half the human race, but would not, they said, for we are expecting salvation." Well, let's go away from Ireland for a minute to Sweden. Now, the Swedes, as is known, are a very practical and modern people. But if you go back a bit, you'll find some very strange Swedes knocking about. And one of them was a Swedish pastor named Peter Ram. He made a statement, a sworn statement, which was legalized, saying his wife had been called out to deliver a fairy baby. She was a midwife, so... And this story is found in various forms in various countries. But it's rarely you get a minister of the Swedish Lutheran Church swearing that it actually happened as true. So greater weight can be placed upon it. What did he have to say? We are called upon to believe that the event actually happened in the year 1660, a year I can only remember myself with some vagueness. Peter Ram alleges that he and his wife were at their farm one evening late when there came a little man, swart of face and clad in grey, who begged the declarant's wife to come and help his wife, who was then in labour. The declarant, seeing he had to do with a troll. Now, I've mentioned this word troll before. It originally meant a great giant that turned to stone if it was still knocking about when the sun came out. But by this stage in folklore, it had meant a little man. It had come to mean a little man. So there's the troll looking up. And he says that his wife needed a midwife. The midwife went. The Lutheran pastor was not terribly anxious that she go, but I think he was rather more afraid of the little man, because although hitherto he had not believed in trolls, he had a fairly hefty belief in them all of a sudden, so he let her depart. She came back in due course. And in fact, she was paid with a heap of silver pieces and clippings, which it is supposed that the troll left out for her. Now, the third article I'm going to dig up from days of yore. We're back in Ireland again, but it was written by one of the witnesses, and it seems to have been a very important, well, not important, but I mean lots of people seem to have been present and to have seen this curious incident. I'm not saying the story didn't grow a bit in the telling, but basically, I think there must be some foundation for it. When this boy was little, he had been stolen by the fairies. Now, don't ever get yourself stolen by the fairies, because you never know, they mightn't let you back. He had been stolen by the fairies, and they had left in his place something rather disgusting. I'm not sure what it was. So they called upon the parish priest. The parish priest was well into fairies, as many parish priests tend to be, it is said. And that was a serious theological remark. Now, where was I? Right. The parish priest interfered. He went for a moment to what? He went for a moment to the changeling that had been left in the child's place. And he said, "Changeling, I command you to turn back into the boy for a moment." Why not in perpetuity, I don't know, but maybe he was limited. "Tell me where the boy is. Be not silent on this matter. I'll count to 3. And the changeling, for a moment, was transformed back into the boy. And the boy told him he was being held by the fairies in the bottom of a lake. "Right," said the priest, "we're all off to the lake. Bring sandwiches." And off they set. Now, right, they took the changeling with them, and they came to the lake. "The first thing we must do," said the priest, "is we dip the changeling in the lake." "I'll go on," said the changeling. "You wouldn't do that." "Oh, yes, I would," said the parish priest. "You're an ugly little scutter." Couldn't you have put that a little more pleasantly? "No, I couldn't. You need a good wash. In you go." So he dipped the changeling 3 times in the lake, and out came the boy who had been kidnapped. Well, you think that would be the end of it. The boy, who doesn't seem to have been suffering from any kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. Incidentally, the lake in question is still there. It's Loch Lane in County Westmeath. It's not very large. Well, anyway, the father of the child put his overcoat round him because the child was stark naked. This wasn't to do with modesty. If you're familiar with the Irish climate, you'll see it was a bloody necessity. Anyway, he wrapped his coat around the child, and home they went. Now, the parish priest had spoken a strong word to the boy's mother. "Don't you dare speak a word to him until we get him home, or you will do him dreadful damage." God, I picked up a very good accent from Jonathan Downes, I must say. "Dreadful damage. Maintain silence. Button it." So back they went, but the mother was in such a state. She was in such a state of anxiety, she said. "Oh, my little Johnny, it's so nice to have you back again." Sorry, Katie, I had to change your sex there for a minute. And, of course, it undid the whole spell. The boy went back into the lake. The parish priest turned round and said, "God help me, why didn't I get a gag for you?" You could see what she was going to get for her next birthday. Now, So back they went again. The boy cried out as he was being taken back to the lake, "Father, father!" He didn't have an Irish accent, I don't quite know why. "Father, father! My mother has spoken. I must go." And he went. "Don't worry," said the priest. "Despite this gabalacious woman's utterances, I can still remedy the situation." And back they went to the lake, the whole troop of them. Well now, when they got to the lake, they got him out a second time. The priest did some heavy praying, and on the way back this time, the mother kept quiet, which, as we all know, is a very difficult task for any woman of the female sex. Especially Katie. Anyway, the thing is that the writer of this article was a witness to the proceedings, which were seen by large numbers of locals round about. Now, this is about as near as you can get to good evidence in an anecdotal style. A large number of witnesses see the phenomenon. If you were to look out there and see some strange creature and see it alone, it wouldn't be much good saying it. But if half the audience looked out there, the half that walked out when it came to my lecture, then more weight would have to be attached to what happened. Now, these stories are all from the 19th century, but fairies are in fact seen today. You'll be surprised. Can you all hear me still when I turn my back? I have to go back and forth to this learned lectern. September 1979 was the year of the fairy, more or less, and the fairies were seen not in any rustic rural setting, but in a park in Nottingham. A whole lot of little children rushed into the local primary school and cried, "There are fairies in the park!" And the vice squad went shooting down there immediately. But the school principal questioned the children very thoroughly. Now, this happened in 1979, which for someone of my age is not so long ago. And even for some of you here, you may well remember it. I don't expect mere young things like yourself to remember 1979. Mendacity is my strongest asset. But they were seen by 4 children in a place called Woollerton Park. There were around 60 of them, and they were driving in little cars. Now, what these children meant exactly by little cars, it's difficult to say, but sketches they drew showed things remarkably like little motor cars. Fairies never drove motor cars when I was young. I blame those Noddy books in which he has that little yellow car. And I mean, how the heck did Noddy get a driving license? He never had driven before, and they gave him a yellow car, and the first thing he did was try to run down Plod the policeman. But I digress. This incident happened insofar as that these children all claimed to have seen this. They corroborated each other. They drew similar pictures. Again, it's only an anecdote. They didn't bring a little fairy back to be chopped up on some scientist's laboratory table. And if you should run into a fairy, I wouldn't recommend such a course of action either, because the fairies were not always friendly. In fact, they were downright feared at times. But I have a number of other little tales here. One of them happened in my mother's native city, Limerick. Now, this happened in 1938. A boy called John Keeley was out for a walk. Well, there wasn't a lot to do in Limerick in 1938. You could go out for a walk or throw stones at people, and that was about the size of it. And he was out for a walk, and what should he see but a little man? "Hello, little man," said he. Polite little soul. The little man chatted a bit with him. He wasn't terribly forthcoming. He did suggest John Keeley should push off somewhere else. But John Keeley thought, "I'll bring a few witnesses along next time I go down this road." So he stuck several men in a hedge. Have you ever tried sticking men in a hedge? Not an easy task, but it can be done. And indeed, if it happened in modern times, they'd have made a T-shirt saying, "I was stuck in the hedge by John Keeley." And when Jonathan ceases to do his imitation of the laughing policeman, we shall continue. Now, the thing is, the next time, there were two little men there, but there were also a lot of big men hidden in the hedge having a look on, and they all saw them. The little men, however, "Why are you giving a Nazi salute from the back with your..." Anyway, the little men, realizing they were observed, took off. I don't think they flew away, they ran like Billy-O into the bushes. And the men in the hedges came rushing out. It's quite hard to rush out of a hedge. Has anyone here ever been in a hedge? Well, once you're in your hedge... Oh, you've been in a hedge. Well done, Paul. Well, the thing is, you've been in a hedge, yes.
My brother pushed me in.
Your brother pushed... That's the sort of thing brothers do. Well, anyway, the men in the hedge gave chase, but they could not catch up with the little men. Now, I could go on, but you're probably getting tired of the sound of my voice. But Janet Board, whom some of you will have read books of, I would hope, has said that in reports of fairies, they are sometimes said to be capable of going through solid objects. And Diarmaid McManus, an Irish writer, has an account of how an alleged fairy sighting resulted in the fairy disappearing suddenly like that. It was as if he walked into the air and disappeared. And that may, if fairies do exist, give us the clue to what they are and where they come from. But before I go into that, I understand there is in the audience a personage who has actually seen a pixie cat. Now, I don't know how you tell a pixie cat from a non-pixie cat. Maybe they're smaller. I'm going to ask him what it was like. What was this pixie cat like, then?
I thought you were joking. It was a little cat about that big. And I was driving up a hill in Cornwall, and it kind of just reared up as cats do with the arch back, hissed at the car, disappeared.
Well, it's just what I'd do if I were a pixie cat and a car came hurtling towards me. But not alone have we someone who's seen a pixie cat. We have someone whose house has been infested by sprites. Here we have Saskia and Susan. And the sprites, I believe, are... No, it's not elementals.
Elementals.
Now, the term elementals was used for fairy folk, really, first of all, by a character called Paracelsus. Celsus was a great scientist in ancient times, and Paracelsus said, "He's just nothing compared to me," so he called himself Paracelsus, the greater Celsus. And he called fairies elementals. And these two ladies have had elementals buzzing about them like anything. Their house has been dive-bombed by elementals, insofar as I can judge, and I'm going to ask them to describe what these elementals look like. Sasha, you're the Gobbio one, could you?
Thanks, Ronan. Well, it was just before Sarah's birthday we actually decided we were going to invoke Pam for the party that we were having in the garden. And I was talking to Sarah about probably a load of nonsense, and So I sit up, so I turned around to have a look and see what she was looking at, and I saw this like silver line just streak across the top of the curtains in the living room. Sarah had seen it streak across the bottom. But with it being Sarah's flat, we do not share a flat, I just like to say that categorically.
Oh, I thought you were an item.
I'll put you on to say.
Yeah, just a streak of light going across the bottom of the dining room table. And it transfixed me so much that it stopped me the conversation and went, wow. And as I was telling Tasha what it was, she saw it go up the side. Besides that, we've always got little orbs floating about around the floor. I've had a tree spirit come in, and they're quite shy. When they come in, they tend to hide behind the corner doors and just sneak around underneath tables and things.
If they're hiding around the door...
You can actually see things rustling around. It's not like we're hallucinating. And
my
they
goodness.
do actually... She's got this tablecloth over, well, obviously the table, and they kind of ferret around underneath there, and there's things moving, and you have a look, there's nothing there. So there's something going on, and we like to call them elementals.
Yes, well, I suppose elementals is as good a thing, but what I'm trying to get across is there are a lot of anecdotal tales. Well, is that a tautology? There are a lot of anecdotes about fairies, and many of them are backed up by quite reliable witnesses. I mean, you've only to look at those two out there. Yes, I didn't really mean you should stare at them, because they get embarrassed easily. I mean, anyone with hair the colour of Sarah's would get embarrassed if stared at. Now, the thing is that if they do exist at all, where do they come from? Well, they don't exist in large populations, breeding populations or anything like that just down the road or in the hedgerow. But where they do exist, I reckon, is in a dimension coexistent with ours, if they do exist. I'm not saying I believe in fairies, but I'm saying I don't disbelieve in them. And what they can do, if you imagine the universe as something like a track in an athlete's stadium, and there are a whole lot of lanes, and as you know, the athletes run extremely fast. My $6 million man days were not wasted. Extremely fast. Well, the thing is that these alleyways, if you like, these lanes that the athletes run down, would parallel the parallel dimensions of the universe. Now, I thought this was all science fiction when I was young, and that we're going a few years back in that case. I mean, some of you don't think I'm really old at all, I understand, but there is one child here who has been calling me granddad since he arrived. Anyway, the thing is that I understand physicists are now entertaining the distinct possibility of coexisting dimensions. And of course, if there are coexisting dimensions, there can be creatures in them, and it is not impossible that one can cross to the other. Therefore, Diarmaid McManus's disappearing fairy or leprechaun or whatever he saw wasn't really disappearing, but he was crossing from one dimension to the other.